Hey, while I stare at this black mirror and this image of my attractive self, um, I'm looking at Bill C-297, which is an act respecting a national strategy for suicide prevention. And so I shall read this to you now. This is from the parliament.ca. Whereas suicide is a complex problem involving biological, psychological, social, and spiritual factors and can be influenced by societal attitudes and conditions, whereas Canadians want to reduce suicide and its impact in Canada, and suicide prevention is everyone's responsibility. That's Kantian morality. Whereas, Kantian ethics, actually. Whereas suicide is preventable by knowledge, care, and compassion, and concentrated action by committed communities, governments, organizations, and resources across Canada will go a long way towards preventing deaths by suicide and assisting, educating, and comforting those who have been affected by suicidal behaviors. Whereas suicide is a significant public health issue in Canada and entails a social cost because grief and trauma have long-term and devastating effects on individuals and communities. As I said in the history propaganda in the early volumes, suicide is cancer. It spreads the grief to everybody else. Whereas a national strategy that is designed to mobilize policies and services to affect public attitudes towards suicide and its prevention in the interests of all Canadians. And whereas the Government of Canada, in consultation with the ministers responsible for the delivery of health services in each province and territory and national representative organizations of the First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, is encouraging the development of a national strategy for suicide prevention. Now, therefore, Her Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and House of Commons of Canada, enacts as follows. Short title. This act may be cited as the National Strategy for Suicide Prevention Act. Obligations. The Government of Canada must establish a national strategy for suicide prevention that includes a creation of a national medical surveillance program for the prevention of suicide and identification of risk groups. B, a study of the funding arrangements to provide the treatment, education, professional training, and other supports required to prevent suicide and assist those bereaved by suicide. C, the establishment of national guidelines for best practices in suicide prevention based on evidence in key areas of mental health care. D, the creation of programs to identify gaps in knowledge related to suicide and its prevention. E, the use of community-based and cultural-based knowledge for suicide prevention activities. F, a study on the means to reduce stigma associated with being a consumer of mental health, substance abuse, and suicide prevention, intervention, and bereavement services. G, the assessment of access to appropriate, adequate health, wellness, and recovery services, including mental health and substance abuse services for all Canadians, as well as for families and communities. H, a study on the reduction of access to means and methods for people to harm themselves. I, a study on the development of media knowledge of suicide. J, the establishment of a national standard for the training of persons engaged in suicide prevention whose contact with potentially vulnerable populations provides an opportunity to identify at-risk individuals and direct them to an appropriate assessment and treatment. Consultations. Within 120 days after the day on which this section comes into force, the Government of Canada must consult with the ministers responsible for the delivery of health services in each province and territory and the national representative organizations of the First Nations, Inuit, Métis people to inquire into, develop, and report on a national strategy for suicide prevention under this Act. Report. The Government of Canada must prepare a report on the national strategy for suicide prevention within 1 year after the conclusion of consultation undertaken under Section 3. Tabling of report. The Government of Canada must cause a copy of the report made under Section 4 to be laid before each House of Parliament on any of the first 90 days on which the House is sitting after the completion of the report. That all seems pretty reasonable, right? But here's the thing. The more power that we give to the government, and the more that we put this message out there, right? There's a saturation point. I've said this when I was referring to that Navy admiral, in that once again with the internet, like once you put it up there, it's there forever, right? If people that want help will seek help. Those, because again, suicidal people that are actually suicidal will just go and do the act. They'll just go and do it. They'll just shoot themselves in the head, right? But the means by which, again, looking at this section here, a study on the reduction of access to means and methods for people to harm themselves. So that's a little bit too obtuse, a little bit too abstract, because you can't reduce people's access to water. You can drown yourself in an inch of water. You really can. You can step in front of a bus. That's suicide. Suicide by cop is another means. Anything that looks like an accident has the potential to be that anything that is labeled as an accident has the potential to actually have been a suicide attempt. And actually, within the COVID times, there was reports of misrepresentation of the statistics, as if to arrest public paranoia and panic. But when the entire population is using and abusing not just pharmaceuticals, but also gambling and street drugs, and then also because of the this is all correlated, as they're saying, I'm on board with this. This is great. This is a great effort, but I'm wondering how it's going to be applied. That's where I'm at right now. How is this going to be applied, especially with the surveillance, right? Because a government overreach is a thing. And no matter what the intentions are of an act, and say like with the censorship bill, as that needs to be separated. I agree with that, right? There should be two separate bills, because the tabling of all things everything all at once is damaging. It's damaging, and it has a much greater potential for irreparable harm on the human psyche. And so, like, stuff like this, again, if we keep bombasting and bombarding the message, then it removes the meaning and the empathy behind it, right? Because then I care a lot sort of thing, right? I care. Caring too much is a problem that leads to exploitation, because as is the motivations a lot of the times. Again, I'll say it before. I'll say it again. Women attempt suicide for attention most of the time, and women attempt suicide more often. And it is like that was one of the motivations from my sociology, whatever, do it for attention, revenge, and men succeed more often. See, and so like stuff like GBA can't really be applied to this kind of scenario, and overarching medical ethical doctrines influence the usage and the implementation of these acts. And not everyone is suited to be a leader. That's just how it is. And even the leaders in charge make mistakes. They make huge fuck ups. And say no more. I'm not going to get too much further into this past 10 minutes, because again, what matters is the intervention. And when we put barriers between the good intention, right, the good and pure statement, and the intervention, which stops the behavior, right, then that is evil, and that is unjust. Especially when the people that know suicidal people the best are the ones that were or are close to them. But when it comes to the influence of culture and this the subjectivity, manipulation tactics that were being used and have been used by the far left and leftist leaning ideologies, again with social Marxism, trying to achieve this utopia of equality and diversity and inclusion, it doesn't work. Because every single case of suicidal ideation is unique to the person and unique to their circumstance. So this is good, but then it comes down to the actual treatment of the person. And the abuses of power happen between the act and the action. That's all I'm going to say on this right now. I'm pissed off about the censorship bill. I really am. Because of government overreach. The potential for abuse is huge, just like the CRA. Okay? That's where I'm at. Thanks for listening.